Oh, hi, it's Andy from Centrobed. We've got Charlie with me today.
Hello.
And we're just going to be running through a study on Curtis, who's 6 years old, and how it changed his life with our turning bed.
Yeah, so we got a bit of a preface, bit of information just before we go into the video. So as Andy said, obviously Curtis is a 6-year-old. He's got severe cerebral palsy, which means he requires a powered wheelchair. His condition also means he suffers from scoliosis, frequent chest infections, breathing problems, hip dysplasia, epilepsy, sleep apnea, and blindness. The severity of Curtis's condition means that he would need constant hospital appointments and care, and make it quite difficult for the parents, obviously, to settle down. So as a result, they reached out through DIY SOS, and we managed to get Curtis a bed. From what we've got from the case study, it's obviously been great help. The father was pleased to help us with providing as much information as he could. So the parents are happy, and it's good for Curtis too. So next we're going to move on to the case study video. So this video is going to outline obviously the things I've already spoken about and the benefits for the parents.
Curtis gets poorly, so he spends a lot of time in bed. And if he's in bed and he's poorly, he needs more physio. But when he's that unwell, he doesn't like the physio, because if you've got a chest infection and you're unwell, the last thing you want is somebody sort of beating your chest and your back. So by him being in bed and staying in bed and getting the rest he needs, we have a concern that then the chest infection will get worse. But then with the bed and you know, the box that is the tilting mechanism, you press the button, it then tilts and rocks him every 30 minutes, hour and a half, 2 hours, and his chest infections go quicker. We've stuck to the half an hour because that was the one we started with and it works, so we don't want to jinx it by not using it. And I think also it's when we've spoken to his respiratory physiotherapist up in London and we said, look, we've got this tilting mechanism, and they were like, wow, what's it like, how does it work? Told them all about it. And they went, as much physio as possible. I said, well, we've got and I told them the timings. They went, if he's happy with every 30 minutes, then go with 30 minutes. And Curtis will sleep through most things, to be fair. But yeah, that works for him. We literally lie him flat in bed, and then put the tilting mechanism on, and then that way he sort of gets the half hour on one side, and then it settles back, and then it turns around and does half hour on the other side. If he's particularly unwell, then we can side lie him, and that's where you can then press all the different buttons on the bed to position him, to keep him in a position that you want him in. And even then we can put him on the tilting mechanism then, so we'll have a good half hour side lying, and then it may put him on his back for half an hour and then roll him back. But it has changed his life. It's changed our lives because we're not in hospital. He sleeps solidly. He doesn't wake up because of the tilting mechanism. I think if anything, it's quite soothing, and he goes to sleep because of it. It's sort of like being rocked to bed. But no, he goes to bed, and we don't really have any issues or problems with it. Because of the extent of Curtis's illness, he gets continued care. So he has 5 nights a week where we have healthcare assistants or nurses with Curtis. But it was a case of every sort of, by the time you'd manually reposition Curtis, and we were saying sort of every sort of 45 minutes you'd want to reposition him. By the time you'd repositioned him and moved him and got him comfortable, it was almost then time to turn him back round the other way. He wasn't getting as much turning because the time it took to manually turn him. Whereas the bed, It sort of does it with a push of a button. It literally gets him into that position really quickly. So it saves time for us. It means we're not disturbing Curtis by picking him up and moving him and rolling him, because that would wake him up. Whereas because of the smooth action of the bed, it doesn't wake him up. So he gets a good night's sleep. If he's unwell, he gets a good night's solid rest. The usual routine for Curtis is that he's well for the summer, and then come autumn, winter and spring, we're in and out of hospital constantly. It's a high cost for Curtis to be in hospital. I think the problem is that it's sort of the fragmentedness of the pots of money. So if Curtis had the tilting mechanism 2 years ago, we wouldn't have had the constant stays in hospital, because since we've had tilting mechanism on the bed, we've not been in hospital. So the cost implication is, if it's given early enough, then it prevents him to going into hospital. With the cost for us, it's the going there and the coming back, and sort of and the emotional cost, I suppose. And it's the quality of life for Curtis, because you know, we're being told, you know, Curtis is extremely poorly, he might not pull through. You know, it's seeing how we go in the next 24 hours, and luckily he's a tough little cookie. He pulls through. But it's the fact that since we've had the tilt mechanism, we've not had that emotional stress. His health and well-being has been tremendous, for the fact that we had to phone the hospital to go and meet the doctors and the nurses, because he's not been in hospital for the last 16 months. So we've just had our first autumn, winter and spring where we've not been in hospital, we've not had pneumonia, we've not had double pneumonia, we've not been in high dependency unit, and we've not been told that we had to say our goodbyes. And that's the first time. Curtis is now 6.5. That's the first time that's ever happened. The tilt and turn in bed is a life changer for Curtis. Yeah, absolute life changer. Because if he's unwell, he can still get physio. When he is well, he's still getting physio. When he's in bed, and he can't move himself. Curtis hasn't got the ability to move himself. We have to move Curtis for him. So it means that the fluids and any gunk that's in his airways or in his chest is constantly being moved, and it isn't sitting there. Bacteria doesn't get to grow, infections don't get a chance to grow, and then when he then is awake and he has his normal physio, everything's moved. So it works in conjunction with all the stuff we're doing already, but it just means from the time he goes to bed to the time he goes and wakes up, that isn't lost time. It's almost like a therapy. So he can have, you know, it's a form of physio, but when he's asleep.
Hands-free.
Hands-free physio, it's brilliant. And he gets to sleep. And it means as parents, we get to sleep, because you're not worrying that he's going to get a chest infection. The worry's gone that he's going to be poorly. The worry is like, well, he's been in bed for, you know, 6, 7, 8 hours sleep, and we haven't done any physio. Right, we'll have to get up and we'll do the turning overnight. So it's all those things, you know, they go completely. You know, you put Curtis to bed, he gets comfy, you set him up for the night, you press the button, the bed goes into the mode that you want it to go into, Curtis sleeps through the whole thing, wakes up in the morning not knowing that he's had 10 hours sleep with 10 hours of physio, and he's probably wondering why he can breathe better and why he's quite happy in the morning. We have a suction machine for Curtis, so we can move secretions and stuff from his mouth and airways. We use it, but we're not using it to the extent that we used to use it. So we were having to manually remove secretions from Curtis because there was a build-up and he was coughing them up. And Curtis would have a build-up of secretions in his esophagus, in his windpipe, that were just basically lining that, and moving them was a nightmare. It took forever, but when he did move them, they completely blocked his airways, and it was like a big ball of phlegm. It was horrible, and we panicked as parents. He panicked because he couldn't breathe, and you're trying to get the suction machine working and everything else. We haven't had that since. When we were seeing doctors and going, like, is there a medicine for this? Is there a form of physiotherapy we can use for this? Is there anything we can do to remove this? And we were told, no, it's constant physio. You know, the more physio you do, the more it do. But there is only so much time in a day that you can fit in 3, 4, 5 30-minute physio sessions. With the bed tilt, I don't know what it does, but the moving, the rocking, the turning, it moves everything, and he just gets rid of it in another way. It doesn't sit there and it doesn't stick there, because when he was in bed, he was static. Whereas now, even if he's lying flat, there's that turning, so things are moving. Gravity gets hold of them and pulls them to one side. He goes the other side, gravity gets hold of it and pulls it the other side. So it's constantly on the move, which means that he can't sit there and become an infection. It's great. Brilliant. Seriously great. Every child like Curtis should have one of those. It's the cost implication. If you pay out for it here, you don't have the £1,000 a day hospital bill at this end. We've sort of had reductions in sort of meds use and everything else, because we were having meds to reduce the secretion build-up. So we're on less meds because we're not having to try and dry them out or remove them through medication. It's a case of we don't need those. He was on a combination of medications to try and get rid of all of these secretions that his body was making and producing, and it got to the point where it was drying him out too much, because the combination of the bed and the physio that we were doing and just meant that he was having too much of this, and so then he was getting a dry mouth. Curtis never had a dry mouth. So it was like, well, now why is that happening? So we've had to reduce his meds because there isn't a build-up of all the secretions, and he's not coughing, so he's not constantly bringing phlegm up and secretions from his chest and his windpipe, and they used to well at the back of his throat, and they used to just sit there, and he'd constantly be coughing, trying to remove them, which is exhausting. And so we had to have medications to try and dry them up and to stop him producing so many secretions. Now we've had to lessen the amount of saline nebs that he was having, and we've had to reduce the amount of inhaler that he was having, and we've had to reduce the amount of tablets that he was having, because it was a combination therapy for the secretions. But we've gone the other way now, where we're too dry. So we've had to lessen them until we've got the right balance, that he's got enough, so he's got a dry, sort of a moist mouth, so we can, the same as you or I, but not to the extent of where he's overproducing them. And you do notice the difference. When we've been on holiday and we've not had the bed, you notice the difference. We have to up the meds. Really? And we have to try and fit in more physio sessions. Because if we go on holiday, he doesn't have a tilt and turn in bed.
That was the case study for Curtis, and that's the father giving his side of the story of his experience over the last 16 months that he's had. So, Andy, do you mind explaining other conditions?
When we first brought out the turning beds, primarily it was for MS patients. Then later on we went through to motor neurone. Muscular dystrophy boys was the big one. We got asked to develop a bed for a boy down at Trelaw at the college down there. And the idea was that every night it was taking 2 people to reposition his legs in bed, because naturally they spanned out. And his knees were going in opposite directions. It was very difficult because he was an atypical boy. He was 6 foot and he weighed about 18 stone. So the legs were really quite difficult to move. So we brought through the Arctic bed, designed it so that it could reposition you and then straighten everything up, make sure your knees are in line with your hips and your shoulders. And we've sort of gone from strength to strength with that for cerebral palsy. A lot of cerebral palsy children and young adults are now using the bed for keeping them straight at night, and actually doing a sort of special type of turning, which is a V turn, where you stay in a V and it will just turn you from one side to the other in this V, and it keeps you as straight as possible. So that means you're less likely to have to use other pieces of equipment on top of the bed. The merger neurone, it's basically just to get them in the best position as possible so that they're comfortable. Tissue viability, that was a good one. We had a really good case a couple of years ago where someone developed a pressure sore, and it was about 100 millimeters in diameter and about 50 deep. I think we had the bed out for about 8 weeks, and it reduced it down to 50 diameter, and it was about 20, 25 mil deep.
What conditions, in your experience, have you found that the turning beds, the Arctic, Caribbean and Amazon, have been helpful for?
Well, I can only bring you something that happened only a week ago. I was doing a bed assessment for a young girl about 12 years old with cerebral palsy. My mum was getting up umpteen times in the night, and there was repositioning, and every time they repositioned, they had a sleep system on there, and they had to reposition that, and it was taking 45 to 50 minutes, 6 or 7 times a night. What we did was to get the young lady onto the bed. We just let her relax and take her natural shape. She had a lot of scoliosis as well. And I did notice that, and one pointed it out, that her hip was, the top of her hip was actually touching the lower rib on her rib cage. And you can see where it made it quite sore, but both areas were quite pink. You can actually see the bone. Oh. And so what we did was we just put her into a small V, relaxed her up over the next 15 minutes. I noticed that she was much, much straighter. I knew that would happen. Nobody else seemed to understand it's going to be as good as that. But what we actually did, took to take the measure out, measure between, and it was 5 inches difference that straightened her up. It was now 5 inches from the top of her hip to the lower rib. And beforehand, they would just crash together. So it's little things like that. But what it meant, though, is you can reposition the bed. Mum was doing everything in about 5 or 10 minutes instead of 50 minutes in the night. So and the bed was going to be continually turning, keeping her straight, but in a V.
You've worked with a chap in New Zealand.
Yeah, Marcus is an ex-professional footballer down in New Zealand, and he's got motor neurone. He asked us, could he have a bed all the way down there? And we said, well, you know, we can't really give you the backup and everything. But he had good people with him. So he took the bull by the horns and said, can you get the bed down? We got the bed down to New Zealand. And then he was asking us if we could produce a program, which is what we do. If people have a specific program that they like, and they can do it manually on the bed, and we can recreate that in the auto box. And this is how we build our programs up. For Marcus, it was quite a good one because he wanted his leg to be moved in a certain way. And within using the knee brake and the side turn together, it did just what he wanted. And what it meant for him, as he said, it gets more nights sleep without waking up, and he feels better in the morning. So for Marcus, it was a really big improvement for him. Other things we've got, going back in the early days, a lot of the beds were for MS patients, and there's so many that we helped with the bed. And again, it was one particular lady, I think it was down in Devon. We had a turning bed down there. We went back about 3 years later and said, how did it go? But basically what she came back and said is, instead of only being able to sleep 3 hours a night before having to get up and going into a wheelchair because she was so uncomfortable, she could stay between 6 and 8 hours in an evening. So much so, when she first got the bed, she wasn't quite sure if the bed was working, because when she woke up in the morning, she was in the same position as she was when she went to sleep. The clock had gone round and she was 6 hours on. And yes, the bed had been working. I think she put an alarm clock on in the end to check. But it's that, so it doesn't disturb people during the night. I think that's one of the main things. And with the latest programs, they're so much more comfortable. I lay on the bed the other day and actually tested it myself. I think, I could stay all night, all in this bed. And the advantages of just not being completely on your shoulder with all the weight going through one side, and the advantage of having a 30-degree turn that's supported and keeps you in that position. It's just so much better way to do it.
Having that turning, say anyone who's got a chest infection, surely it would help.
Yeah, it was very early when we developed the bed. We had a small study done in an ITU unit in the Midlands, and for us it was a bit of an eye-opener, because the biggest thing they identified was the continual motion of the movement would lessen the secretions by keeping them mobilized, and they wouldn't clot together and give you those chest infections that nobody wants. And that was their biggest call on it, apart from the pressure relief, which they were looking at as well. We had the bed mapped in Bournemouth at I think it was Odstock at the spinal unit. And what that meant was we got some mapping out, and it showed you could actually prove to people what the pressure was, pressure on, pressure off, and the advantage of doing 30 to 40 degree turns rather than a full 90. It just gives you what you want, less pressure all over really, and means you don't have to move so often as well.
So the next video I'm going to play is just the technical specification of the bed, so it just gives you a bit more of a close-up of the Arctic's function, so especially a focus on the knee brakes, which is particularly good for the dystrophy boys. The legs is the main thing, having the individual knee brakes as well as the turning to reduce the pressure is the key factor really.
And it's giving them the independence as well. Some of the technical sides of it, it can go up to a maximum of 50 degrees, and you can stop at any point you like on the way to 50 and back. Yeah. Automatic auto box that can be plugged in. Nowadays, it has around about 150 programs that we've now developed as new ones over the last years. And that can just continue on through the night, every half an hour, every hour, every 2 hours in cycle time. And there's some really quite interesting programs in the last 6 months we've developed, and they're using everything available. The backrest would be auto, the knee brake would be auto, and so the side turning. And it just gives you some really great positions so you can be comfortable in bed. I think that's the main thing, getting people sleep longer and not get people up in the night. There's the battery box, which allows you between 24 and 36 hours of battery life. So if you have a power cut, the bed's going to continue to work. We make these in all different sizes. With the two new models, the Caribbean it's like a junior size one for the smaller children, and it can grow as they get bigger. The bed can be made bigger as well. But for the larger adults, we see a lot of people up to 6'6" these days, 6'7", even 7 foot and beyond. For them, we do the Amazon, which takes you up to a mattress size of about 7.5 feet. So again, it's expandable. Width-wise, we do a 3 foot, we do a 42-inch, and we do a 4 foot as well. So these are just some of the different ones we do. There are low start ones as well if required. And we do cater for other little bits and bobs on the bed if you were to require it.
So thank you for your time today. We have got other DIY SOS videos that should be coming up soon. So it'll help us with the case studies. It helps us learn about how the beds are helpful for families, the users as well. It's just giving a bit of independence back.